Second, to introduce myself, my name is Johan Detweiler. I'm the Senior Director of Compliance with Stack Armor. Also on the call, we have Martin Rieger, the Chief Solutions Officer with Stack Armor. We also have Mark Willis, Chief Information Security Officer with Bluescape Software. And we also have Douglas Stonier, FedRAMP Manager for Shaman, a FedRAMP authorized 3PAO. So why don't we go ahead and dive in? Martin, you want to take it away?
Yes, sir. And thank you, Johan. Before we begin, we did want to recognize this day in history, which is the day that ultimately led to the United States entering World War II, specifically the air raid on Pearl Harbor. Myself, I served in the U.S. Navy, and this is near and dear to me. But that being said, over 2,300 lives were lost. Of the 12 ships that were sank, the USS Arizona was completely destroyed, along with the USS Oklahoma capsizing. That being said, we definitely want to make sure we remember the importance of this day. So we appreciate your time. We appreciate you joining us today, and we'll go ahead and kick things off. So first and foremost, a little bit about Stack Armor. We're based in Tyson's Corner, just outside of Washington, D.C. We are one of the first 8 service providers selected by Amazon to be a part of the AWS Global Security Compliance Program. That was formerly known as the ATO on AWS. We're also the first and still the only North American Shield advanced partner for North America, in addition to serving both public sector customers, federal, state, and local governments. We do provide a wider range of services, not just NIST and FedRAMP. We support ISO, aerospace, healthcare, PCI, SOC 1, SOC 2, in addition to being an advanced consulting partner. We carry a variety of disciplines and competencies, most notably each across the AWS, East, West, and GovCloud regions. Our capabilities, as it relates back to authorities to operate for both FedRAMP and DoD, cover some very core services, most notably NIST advisement. This is to ensure that cloud service providers and their service offerings are designed and developed to meet those rigorous requirements of each of the frameworks we're going to talk about, most notably DoD Impact Level 4. In-house, we develop full documentation, leverage our 10 years of DoD assessment and authorization experience, in addition to providing a variety of other services and capabilities. The way we do this is leveraging a solution we call FASTER, which is faster ATOs with Splunk, Telos, and Threat Alert for regulated markets. It is an AWS vetted program. You can find it in the marketplace. It leverages our Threat Alert ATO accelerator that includes automated deployment for in-boundary solutions, the Telos Exacta 360 tools and technologies for preparing packages, managing controls, including POAMs, vulnerability scans, and preparation of ATO packages. Mark?
Hey, thanks, Martin. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. Martin, as someone who spent 6 years in the Army, and we always like to make jokes about the Navy people like yourself. We used to actually say when we were running cadence, GI grits and GI gravy. Gee, I wish I joined the Navy because the food wasn't always the best. So anyway, the Navy does get some things right. What is Bluescape? So here we are, right? So Bluescape has received our provisional authority from DISA as of July 29th of this year. So who are we, and why did we, embark on this journey? The company is about 10 years old. We still are considered a startup. We are a very aggressive, small team, just over 200 people, working day and night as a subsidiary of Hayworth, our company that owns us in Michigan. We are used right now within DC in the IC through a lot of different on-prem deployments through third parties that deploy us into certain environments, as well as the media and entertainment in Hollywood. There is basically every single major motion picture company in the Hollywood area is using Bluescape. And in both cases, Hollywood and the IC, protect their data very, very carefully, and are impressed with the way we go about handling that. And that was one of the things that got us on the list of one of the most innovative companies and next big thing in tech, because we're really crossing the boundary and not being stovepiped into one specific sector, if you will. The customer use cases, that why are people using Bluescape? The pandemic really, accelerated this quite a bit when people had to work from home, and all these use cases here, and there are more than these. But from a security perspective, we look at teams whiteboarding, brainstorming, and in the case of our sponsor, the U.S. Air Force CyberWorks on the DoD side, they're using Bluescape for a lot of these use cases. Agile development, mission planning, and incident tracking is something that I have been talking about with the Air Force and with people at RSA. All kinds of use cases for the workspace content, where you can talk just like you're talking here. You can have a canvas, you can upload content, and it's not just one person talking and 50 people listening. Everybody can contribute and participate at the same time. So moving on to the next slide, Martin, that's what we're doing to solve these key challenges, right? Everybody's, geographically dispersed, especially for the pandemic. And a lot of people have just decided to not go back into the office. Knowledge sharing, right? Again, secure, agile, it all comes together within the Bluescape workspace, within a canvas. Everybody's contributing real time to get something or some things done. And that was a known quantity that we had in the IC and in Hollywood. And then within DoD, talking to U.S. Air Force CyberWorks, the discussions came around to, hey, can you guys, get this on SaaS? Can you get this up and running in GovCloud? Can you, and we had and that kind of kicked off our internal discussions that there were other entities, even on the FedRAMP side as well, agencies that want to use us. So we wanted to bring forward Bluescape in the sense that by using Bluescape, you're going to have at least 20% reduction in internal timelines, 60% reduction in time looking for documents, and 15% less time in meetings. And this really proved itself out to be the case during our 3PAO audit. I'm sure Doug will talk about it a little bit in his area today, that when we met with Doug and the Shaman team a year ago and did our audit, we had so much content within the Bluescape environment that we were able to get in and get out. And, Martin, if you had said what, 30-40%, you thought maybe reduction in time just within the audit itself by using Bluescape to get in and out. And with that, I'll hand it over to Doug to provide his perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Yes, I'm Doug Sonier from Shaman. Shaman, we have quite a few feathers in our cap, but just to keep it brief to what's appropriate to you all on the call, we are one of the leading 3PAOs in the FedRAMP space. We also participate in the CMMC practices. That includes key discussions with the PMOs regarding updates to requirements and the future state of the FedRAMP and CMMC practices. You can continue. But what would be more appropriate to all of you on the call? Shaman, we are the number two provider of FedRAMP assessments on the marketplace, and one of the first authorized CMMC C3PAOs. With that said, we are a type A, so we only perform the audit assessment portion, whereas StackArmor is more on the advisory side portion, as Martin was discussing in his slides. And we are 100% independent. Some key items that we do are FedRAMP ready assessments, FedRAMP ATO assessments, that includes your agency, your JABs, and DoD IL4, IL5 assessments. We also perform continuous monitoring, gap assessments, anything that's associated with the FedRAMP and federal space.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your introductions. So real quick, today's learning objectives. We're going to learn a little bit about the requirements and paths for DoD cloud authorization, planning and prep, data sensitivity and the shared models, budgeting, personnel, project management, and then we're going to get some much needed advice from Doug and 3PAOs. And then we'll hopefully summarize it all in lessons learned. But before we jump in, Martin, can you tell us a little bit about what is the Cloud Authorization Program and DISA?
Absolutely. So first, let's kind of set the stage. DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency. This agency is a department of DoD. They have a very specific responsibility, which includes developing and maintaining the security requirements guide for cloud computing. We refer to this as the SRG. Now, the SRG is what defines all of those baseline requirements for offerings leveraged by DoD so that they can assess and determine what the overall security posture is and what the residual risk may or may not look like. The ultimate goal here is getting down to what we call a provisional authorization that would allow a CSP to then host the data that is supporting DoD missions. This document has been updated as of January 14, 2022. There are some specific things that we want to kind of lay out here, which is to say that there is a big difference between a PA and an ATO. The PA is a provisional authorization that can be leveraged by authorizing officials and mission owners. It is typically issued with an expiration date, which is a little bit of a differentiator between FedRAMP and the DoD process because FedRAMP ATOs are continuous, ongoing, and don't expire. Within the DoD, they are leveraged until they revoke or eventually expire and can be issued with conditions, with provisions, right, for the cloud service offering and DoD mission owner considerations. It is an ongoing authorization, which is to say there are continuous monitoring requirements. We refer to those as CONMON. And just like FedRAMP, all CSPs must comply with those in order to maintain it. From a reauthorization standpoint, upon expiration, when and if that occurs, it may be reauthorized if there is a continued need. And the CSP does have the requirements to make sure they satisfy all these expectations. So the biggest differentiators between FedRAMP and the DoD authorization process is FedRAMP is really the foundation and has two paths for a cloud service offering. You can go through what's called the Joint Authorization Board or an agency. Now, on the DoD side of things, the process is almost identical. It is like FedRAMP based on FISMA, but also the NIST risk management framework. So using FedRAMP as a foundation, it is supplemented with DoD controls, enhanced parameters, and additional requirements that are just a little bit beyond what the federal government's looking for. There are three paths to obtaining a DoD PA. You can uplift a FedRAMP JAB provisional ATO. You can also uplift a federal agency ATO, which is to say, you can take those packages and authorizations and then submit them to DoD for consideration towards IL4, IL5, and things of that nature. The third path, which is really the one we're going to talk about today, is a component assessed path, which is to say you are originating within the Department of Defense. Impact levels are really defined by the sensitivity of the information. Is it public, private, classified, what's being stored, and then the potential impact around CIA, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. DoD IL2, in use for public and non-critical mission information, is the equivalent of like a FedRAMP moderate. IL4, which is what we're here to talk about today, is really that CUI or non-CUI, but non-mission critical information. In other words, non-national security systems. I'm including the others as well. You've got IL5 for a little bit higher level of sensitivity, mission critical, and then DoD IL6, which is classified secret, and also for for national security systems. 1 and 3 were deprecated when this SRG was revised, and that's why you don't see them. But to help set the stage, you heard me talk about the moderate baseline, and DoD IL2 is the equivalent of the FedRAMP Rev 4 moderate baseline at 325 controls. When we start to look at where things really begin, it is the moderate baseline. There are 325 controls plus 38. That is what's known as FedRAMP Plus, and it's basically FedRAMP plus DoD controls. And when we talk about IL4, sometimes those terms are synonymous, but IL4 being CUI for official use only, PII, PHI situations, you're looking at those 325 plus 38 controls, which gets you to a 363 control baseline. There are steps above that for IL6, but given that that's not really the purpose of today's discussion, I have them here for visibility, and we will be sharing the slides, so you have that information. You can come into IL4, 5, and 6 with a high baseline package, which is to say from the federal government or the JAB. And what that means is the controls and the expectations, there is quite a bit of overlap, but you can submit a FedRAMP high package to DISA and the mission owner without having to reassess, right? Because you've got those controls covered, in which case there are a few additional things that have to be done, such as a general requirements addendum, and of course there is the review process. I'd like to turn it back over to Johan.
Awesome. Thanks, Martin. So I'm not going to lie, you kind of laid out a pretty complex process there. So Mark, what possible reason is there for somebody, an organization wanting to take on something so complex? Why do you dive into this?
Yeah, great question. And it is one that everybody on this call who's considering embarking on this journey really needs to think about, and not just something you think about, in a one-time thing. You really have to kind of give it a crowdsourced approach within the company of like, why are we even discussing this? Why are we doing this? And I mean, ultimately it's because you have potential customers who are asking for your CSP, your product as a CSP, your cloud solution to be considered to go out into the GovCloud SaaS environment. And so, as I briefly mentioned early on, we had already been established within the DCIC with an on-prem solution within their environments, kind of isolated and stovepiped, and then also a track record with a lot of other customers. But as we engaged with more and more DoD entities and in the federal side, different agencies, our federal team, came back to us and said, there really is a need for Bluescape to be in the GovCloud FedRAMP, in this case, IL4, DoD approved environment, because Air Force CyberWorks, who's our mission owner and sponsor, great relationship with them. We've been, engaged with them for over 2 years, and they stepped up and said they would go ahead and sponsor us, because once you get your sponsor and get that going, and then you can start engaging all the other potential agencies and DoD entities and say, hey, we're going to do this. It's going to take some time, but we are committed to doing this. And again, if you have the need out there, you really have to understand, are we doing this just to get out there in the FedRAMP authorization marketplace or approved by DoD? But if there really isn't a need for the CSP in the product, then you have to kind of step back and reconsider that. But in our case, there was a definite need, people asking for it and saying, hey, we'll be patient and we'll be there for you, Bluescape, when you get there, because we really want to use your product in the DoD IL4 type environment.
Awesome. So when you guys sort of made the decision that you were going to go in and go for DoD IL level 4, did you initially approach it thinking that it was Bluescape, you were going to put the system together, do the documentation, get everything ready? Was that the initial plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, this is where Stack Armor obviously comes into play, because you know, and I do see on the names of the calls here, Matt Arndt is on the call. He's from our team. Matt is our Air Force liaison, and he and I work together a lot. And, you know, over 2 years ago with our team, we were like, hey, you know, you perform the gap analysis, right? When you say you're approaching DoD IL4, like Martin said, you've got the 325 moderate plus the 38 IL4 controls. We went ahead and just dug into all of those controls and did a gap analysis and said, okay, based upon Bluescape, you know, current state, how many of these controls do we really satisfy? And let's be honest about it. And that's a key for folks on the call today. Don't try to swag it. Be honest about it. Are you really doing, you know, best practices, and you can definitively defend, you know, what control you're meeting? And as we went through it, we found, yeah, we're actually, you know, meeting a lot of these controls. But when you look at the bigger picture of the policies and the procedures, and putting together the technical and, you know, environment of how to actually deploy this into AWS GovCloud, we were talking to some of our federal partners, and they recommended, hey, if you don't have the manpower and the expertise, you know, and an army, so like someone like Stack Armor, then you should probably talk to Stack Armor about working together as partners to divide and conquer these controls, and together be able to get through this process in a much more highly accelerated fashion. So that's exactly what we did. We got with GP and Martin and the gang over at Stack Armor, and we presented our gap analysis. And we said, yeah, we know we have some gaps. We're not going to, we don't meet all the requirements, you know, all the controls. And so how does this whole Stack Armor threat alert thing work with Bluescape? And as we sat down and discussed and broke down the technical architectural diagrams, and that was one of the first things that we provided them was, here's our current architecture state in AWS commercial, right? How does this transpose into AWS GovCloud with Stack Armor? So when you start doing that type of analysis as a team, you get to the realization that, yeah, we could probably do this, but it's going to take us about 2 to 3 years longer to get there, because we're going to have to hire all these people. They got to know what they're doing. They've got to be US persons, and it's just all these things, just one after another, that stack up. And you're like, you know what? It makes a lot of sense to engage someone like Stack Armor, who knows what they're doing. They're battle tested. They've been doing this for 10 years, and they are going to help us get to that DoD IL4 promised land a lot faster.
Well, and that's really a great point. You keep mentioning how they're going to do it faster, right? And that's the idea of an accelerator. And Stack Armor kind of refers to themselves as an accelerator. Mm-hmm. Martin, what does that mean? What is that concept?
Well, we have a very, very refined process for this that we've developed for CSPs, especially when it comes for DoD cloud authorizations. And first, it revolves around building compliant landing zones within AWS. We mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about faster in that process. So leveraging infrastructure as a code, platform as a code components that support the deployments throughout the infrastructure and as well as the platform. This allows customers like Bluescape and Bluescape as the key example here to deploy their SaaS, inherit as much as possible, while we also provide all of the security and continuous monitoring controls, which is to say, you know, out of that 325 control baseline we talked about a moment ago, we deploy 183 of those controls right off the bat, right? So the next step that accelerates this past that is to say, okay, we've got DISA STIGs, those are your secure technical implementation guides, along with CIS benchmarks for tailoring, hardening, and prepping this environment to be assessed. So this includes all of the vulnerability scanning, including database, all of the security components that come in, for example, from AWS, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, GuardDuty, Security Hub, etc., to get them to the point where, once documented, policies and procedures implemented, they are ready to go through an assessment. And one of the other unique things is that we are not, you know, the type of organization that is just advising and pushing out an environment. we actually monitor, help maintain, and we do support that assessment with interviews, evidence, artifacts as an extension and augmentation of Bluescape. So, once authorized, the process is really DISA and the mission owner sponsor reviewing and authorizing that environment, followed by ultimately moving into continuous monitoring and maintaining all of these activities that are daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and then also, seeking to be listed in the DoD Cloud Services catalog where that provisional ATO resides. It is worth noting that the DISA Cloud Assessment Division supports everyone throughout this process. They ensure that folks like Bluescape maintain and meet all the requirements, especially for things like connection requirements, cloud access points. And something a lot of folks don't know is that this same team is also a part of the reviewing team for the Joint Authorization Board. Back to you.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect place to kick it over to Doug, is ending on this assessment slide. And Doug, this is your bread and butter. What are some things that aren't so commonly known about the assessment process, and some things that you really should know going into this?
Yeah, absolutely. Some things that will trip up a CSP going into this will be the readiness assessment report. From a DoD perspective, this is a requirement that you perform a initial assessment. It's at a high level, and it covers a lot of their mandates, things that you're going to need to cover prior to even jumping into the formal stage of a security assessment plan with a security assessment report. Then that would be the final package you're providing. Other things that you will need to do from a CSP perspective is make sure that you've trained your U.S. persons, train them on social engineering, phishing, train them on their control areas. Those are key things to help make it a smooth transition during the interview processes for our team to understand your system and areas that they need to identify as issues. They also need to be able to, like we're saying here, be able to report any suspicious social engineering things. Our pen test teams are very strong in providing a phishing email attempt that will typically trip up your teams. But if you've provided enough social engineering and training ahead of time, those numbers should be minimum. Don't be alarmed if you do get some items that are issues. Don't expect a clean report. You gotta be able to accept where you have weaknesses and be prepared to speak to the DoD review team and your agency on what you're going to do to correct these issues. And be prepared to remediate any of those 3PAO pen test findings as fast as possible. Typically, anything that is, or I say typically, anything that is identified as a high finding on initial systems like this, whether you go DoD route or the FedRAMP route, are instant showstoppers. These are items that will cause your packages to be held up. You'll enter a remediation phase. You'll have them on your POAM, and the reviewers will question, hey, are you taking care of these? Are you mitigating these issues? They want to make sure that your system is not only prepared for the agency that is taking on that sponsorship, but for those future agencies that are going to plan to leverage your authorized package.
So, this is great advice for preparing for the assessment. And one of the areas that's typically required is an addendum to your classic FedRAMP package, where the DoD talks about general requirements, right? What are the general requirements, and do those factor into your assessment as well?
Yes, absolutely. So those general requirements, previously it was a set of 19 questions that the DoD wanted to check that your system was prepared to meet the DISA and DoD requirements. They've now shortened that to these to 10 new ones. Some of them are old ones, but they tweak some of the language, but they're more open-ended questions, but they're focused around some of the more US security related areas, such as where's the location of your data? Is it located within the US? Are you accessing or are you only providing privileged access to US citizens to your system? Do you have the ability to, are you willing to connect to a BCAP? Are you willing to participate in certain DISA and federal incident response projects? And are you also, does your system have the defense in depth that they're expecting for a system that may contain CUI, right, at the IL4 level? And so those questions go on top of those the FedRAMP and NIST controls that are part of that baseline.
Awesome. So I'm going to hand this one back over. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Martin. I'm going to hand it back over to Mark now to talk about the thing that probably no one really wants to admit, is that all of this has got to be somewhat costly. Mark, can you talk a little bit about the budget? Is there any way to plan for this? What's your advice?
Yeah, that's a real important question, Johan. So to kind of expand on that topic of budget, there are some things that you're just going to have to understand when you embark on this journey, is that it can be expensive for a company, in the sense that to get to the DoD IL4 promised land, or when you're on these journeys, it's going to take a while. And as part of that journey, you're going to have to stand up before the audit, at least 90 days or longer, a continual monitoring environment, CONMON, as Martin mentioned. And CONMON requires what we would deem to be a production environment, and it costs money to monitor that and monitor it correctly to where those reports are accepted by the 3PAO when the audit comes around. And then as you move through the DISA joint validation team process, this system that you've stood up is costing money every single month. So, not to get into specific numbers, but you need to understand and be prepared that the money is going to go one way from outward from your company as a CSP until you get that PA and then those ATOs, and you start onboarding your customers. Then the money starts coming back in, obviously, from the customers. So it's an investment. You're investing in the future of your company into the FedRAMP environment. We know there's plenty of customers there, and we know that the investment in our people, in our technology, in our process is going to get us there. It's just going to take some time. And to touch back on what Doug had mentioned about the 3PAO audit with the social engineering and the pen testing, right? People don't always associate that with budget, but it is expensive. It can be costly to go back and retrofit and fix things if you are found to have numerous criticals or highs within an assessment. So it really makes sense, as Doug said, to pay now, right? Have those third-party pen tests being done now. Any customer that wants to pen test you, I would fully encourage, the more people you can have battle testing your product right now and finding vulnerabilities right now, whether it be static analysis, open source analysis, container scanning, all of that has to be done, and done way, way out early on, which we've been doing for years. So by the time Doug and the team rolled in to do the social engineering, we had everybody really prepared for that. And nobody, luckily, I was on my knees praying that nobody fell for their trick, because they really did put together a great social engineering exercise, an email that really would have fooled a lot of people. But our people were very, very well trained, and we constantly do that. The software itself, when the pen test came around, very few findings, and findings that were medium or low that we jumped, we jumped right on them to fix them, but it wasn't anything that was a showstopper. That was, we just made a commitment to this, Johan, to a long way. When you make your commitment to go to FedRAMP and you have that budget set up, right? Part of that budget to keep those costs down is to make sure that you get all those types of things that Doug was talking about in the assessment locked down and addressed early on, to try to minimize any additional costs other than what it's going to cost to just keep this thing going through a CONMON perspective month to month.
And, talk about cost, and you also mentioned personnel and how they were trained up so that they didn't fall for any of the testing that was performed. And that's kind of a good pivot, because you mentioned earlier, you worked with Stack Armor as an accelerator. But how much, kind of personnel considerations were still on Bluescape, even with you guys having Stack Armor as the accelerator? What are some considerations that other CSPs should think of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so from our perspective, we met internally. We crowdsourced it, right? We had security and engineering and finance and our federal team all together meeting for weeks. Are we going to do this? Do we want to do this? Do we have the people? And is there a commitment from the company, from the CEO all the way down to anybody in the company? And I equate it back to when JFK went to Cape Canaveral and asked the janitor what he was doing, for a job. And he says, well, Mr. President, I'm working to put a man on the moon. Everybody at Bluescape, whether you are a US person or you're not, right? They all feel somehow that they're doing something within the company in some way to help us achieve DoD IL4 and FedRAMP authorization, right? They may not be directly involved, but as a company, everybody knows that. And so as we made that commitment, we had to ask and answer questions such as, who is the project manager? Who is our sponsor liaison? Who's our authorizing official? Who's our technical program manager? Do we have enough US persons on hand right now to pull this off, right? Do we have enough US persons and properly trained US persons to be admins who can go into that environment, log in, 2FA through Okta and get in command line and do what they have to do working with the Stack Armor team? Those types of things, you really got to shake all that out and say, are we really, fully staffed right now? Because the people that pursue these positions, or who will fill these positions and do this work, this is not their only job, right? There's other things. So for example, I'm the CISO of Bluescape, but I'm also the project manager. We also have on the call here today, Matt Arndt. I mentioned Matt, he's our Air Force liaison. And when we talk about EMASS and things like that, Matt's involved with that with our sponsor. So we had to identify the people on our team who would take these roles on and really, be 100% committed to it. And once you have that, then you're in really good shape to engage someone like Stack Armor to say, we've got our act together, we've got the people. And if we need to hire more people down the road, we will budget for that as well, if that is something that we have to do. So that may not be a something that's well understood, but I would hope for the folks who were gratefully taking the time out of their day to join this call and learn today that there's a lot of homework that needs to be done before you just step into this journey. It's a lot of things that have to be looked at.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. And Martin, I'm going to kick it over to you. So, with Mark talking about what is needed from the CSP perspective in personnel, what kind of personnel supplementation can you get from working with an accelerator?
Well, you get folks who specialize and are experts in everything we're talking about today, from deploying the controls, developing the documentation, in addition to configuring and architecting the environment. One of the most notable portions of this is something that Doug and even Mark mentioned earlier, which is that readiness assessment report. That DoD RAR, which is different from the FedRAMP version, is designed, to determine capability, right, and maturity of the organization. Have they actually built, designed, and deployed what they said they were going to, and do they have the security plan, the addendum, and a full, ready-to-go architecture that's operational? Here at Stack Armor, it's getting folks to that point and beyond is what we support. So we provide ISSO-like activities with solution architects, engineers, compliance personnel, along with full continuous monitoring teams that are doing all of those daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly tasks, reviewing audit logs, vulnerability scans, so that the Bluescape team can ultimately focus on their cloud service offering, Bluescape Gov, which is to say they still have responsibilities and they're still a part of everything, but they don't have to go spend a couple $1 million hiring an in-house team to do this, much less fight the battle of trying to keep those folks retained. You know, Mark has also mentioned throughout EMASS, right? Your enterprise mission assurance system that is basically the repository, right? It's mission assurance support services, which is a government-owned system designed for communicating and transferring back and forth all of these documents. Well, as he mentioned, you know, you've got to have at least 2 qualified individuals from the sponsors team, not just your team. And EMASS is how all of that is managed. So, you know, finding a sponsor is great, but even then they have jobs to do. One of those things is their joint validation team responsibility. So what we're saying here is that the sponsor is not there just to sign off on the package. They have to review everything. They have to make sure it's complete. They assist with validating the compliance of the controls. It's not all just on DISA. They also review evidence and make sure it maps back where appropriately assigned, including architecture, data flows, not to mention providing comments back to DISA on items that they may have observed or discovered. Again, that joint validation team works as a group to make sure the mission owner is accepting or not accepting risk for something. That could result in necessary adjudication as a result of those comments for both the CSP and 3PAO. It could eventually lead to something like maybe retesting or modification or updates of package information like the SSP. They do meet weekly, right? So they have a continuous ongoing, there is a group that supports the change control boards and configuration management, as well as, you know, providing weekly input. So it is important to note that the members of that joint validation team do have a lot of responsibility and do support EMASS. The methodology for this is very straightforward in terms of how these things take place and happen. It does start with the RAR and then moves into the SSP plus beyond moderate, plus those additional IL4 controls, or 5 or 6 if you're going that high. The security assessment plan is a joint review. In other words, the CSP, 3PAO, and the mission owner and sponsor. But all of these items together are what make up those critical activities that Mark was referring to, and that Doug also was talking about, which is to say, you know, FedRAMP is a team effort, right? And it's unlike any of the other security frameworks out there where we are all working together to get the government and the Department of Defense the services they need to accomplish their missions.
Awesome. And that's another area that I kind of want to touch on a little bit here with Mark in regards to that preparation. One of the things that you had mentioned is making sure that you have a secure software security program, and how much that can factor into the overall findings and the overall risk that the 3PAO will find during their assessment process. Do you want to talk a little high level about some of the considerations you need to make at the software level?
Yeah, that's a great question, Johan. And so as we were, you know, engaging Shaman and the team for the 3PAO audit, we had, you know, over 2 years of a secure software, a secure SDLC that we had built out over the 2 years plus ahead of time, where we had, again, as a company, made a commitment to eradicating any critical or high static analysis findings, you know, in source code, eradicating any critical or high findings that could be exploited within open source and container scanning. 2 big things that you're going to want to know, because as we go into the environment, you're going to be asked by the 3PAO, what kind of static tools are you using to scan your code, and how do you show us some examples, some evidence, and how this is being done. Show us how you're doing container scanning and what tools are you using for that, and what are your findings, right? Our goal, which we were able to accomplish, but we had to start early on, was that we want to go into this 3PAO audit with a clean sheet, right? With zero critical or high static and zero critical or high open source and containers. And we got there. But it took a lot of work for us to get there. And I guess to Doug's point is that if you're willing, if you can, make that commitment and pay the price now and make sure that your software is clean going into that audit, it's just going to make things so much easier for you when you build out a secure SDLC, right? Starting left to right, you've got like threat modeling, the static analysis, open source, dynamic scanning, and pen testing, right? Again, any opportunity you can get to have someone pen test your product, don't be afraid of it, embrace it, have them battle test it, and point out anything that's going on from a critical and high perspective that you can work off now, in versus having Doug and his team catch it during the audit.
Awesome. Yeah, the secure software, I think, is something that's really often overlooked, and those are some great points you made there. Martin, kicking it back to you, what are some other things that you should really kind of plan and prepare for ahead of one of these PAs?
So when it comes time to ultimately begin, there are some things that you guys really need to know, right? First is understanding the shared responsibility model. And when we talk about shared responsibility, we think about infrastructure, platform, and SaaS and the progression up through those. But there is also a shared responsibility between a cloud service provider and the Department of Defense, or in FedRAMP's case, the US government. So understanding how those shared responsibility models apply is critical. And on the next slide, I'll show a little bit more on that. The other thing is cloud security requirements exist not just for CSPs, but also the mission owners, which is to say they have their own obligations and they have their own responsibilities that go hand in hand with CSPs. The DoD provisional authorization is not the ATO, okay? As we mentioned before, and we kind of went through that process and talked a little bit about, ATOs and provisionals. The provisional is about the actual risk of the offering. The ATO is for the mission owners. So the mission owners are the ones that sign off on the ATO. It is a reciprocal document that can be used again and again, but a provisional authorization has to be elevated to an ATO. The next is there is what are known as cloud access points, and there's an approval process for that, specifically with the mission owner, and it's something that occurs after the provisional authorization has been granted. So understanding that is another critical piece. The continuous monitoring requirements have to be performed before and after the authorization. There's a common misperception when folks review, for example, the RMF process, and they see, well, wait a minute, it says ConMon comes after the assessment and it's last. Now, the moment the system is operational, you're on the hook, right? So you've got to have that evidence ahead of time that shows that you have been doing everything that your security plan states, in addition to the other plans, policies, and procedures, so that when you go through the assessment, you not only have the evidence, but you can also demonstrate your capability. This exists in both FedRAMP and DoD. We talked about EMASS a moment ago, and it is, once again, it is a requirement that is to be used for all cloud service offerings that have a DoD provisional authorization. We had a question about how you go about gaining access to that, which I think may have been answered already, but ultimately it's in coordination with your mission owner. They do have to sponsor you through that. There is training in addition to a common access card for access. That's their token or equivalent of a smart card. Stepping back from that, the kind of last main thing you really need to know is the CC SRG. In other words, you need to read this document. Yes, we as advisors will guide you through it. We have templates for all the documentation requirements. However, as an organization, as a cloud securities provider, you need to know these documents and understand what the models and requirements are for DoD to leverage you. From a shared responsibility model, there's two examples here. As we talked about a moment ago, on the left-hand side, you've got that traditional commercial cloud, stack of infrastructure, platform, and SaaS. And then Amazon as an example, where, as we move from left to right, the responsibility decreases throughout. Well, within DoD and even within FedRAMP, just because as a SaaS provider, you're providing solutions and you're ultimately doing all of these things, providing these services and capabilities, there are still requirements that the DoD and government folks have to do on their side. I mentioned a moment ago that from a computing architecture standpoint, that post-PA step of establishing a cloud access point is really how secure access is obtained for DoD networks connecting to commercial environments. It's literally designed to protect them as well as their network boundary. It is not always required. It's at the discretion of the mission owner. So in other words, not every single system requires it, but you do need to know this up front, right? So as you're working with your mission owners and you're talking about it, this is one of the first questions you kind of should talk about is, are you going to require me to put a cap in place? Or are we going to allow connectivity to the system or the solution as it stands? Johan?
All right. Thank you for that, Martin. So one of the things that we sort of touted was that we're going to share our lessons learned here. And I know we got a few minutes left, and I think this is what a lot of people came for. So Mark, I'm going to kick it over to you. I think you probably have the most important perspective as the CSP. What are some lessons that you learned throughout this entire process, and maybe some advice that you could give other organizations that might be getting ready to dive in?
Yeah. So again, a great question. It's just, where do you start, right? And you have to understand the cloud security requirements as you note here, as Martin said, the CC SRG, the NIST controls, again, be prepared to conduct the RAR. Even if you have a sponsor, they're gonna require it, right? It's a required document. The connection approval process, that's true. I mean, as we go through this, I mean, there's all kinds of lessons learned from a CSP perspective. I would say there was the good, and then there's the gap analysis early on, right? That you have to be honest with yourselves and say, which controls do we meet and which controls do we're just not prepared to satisfy, right? And once you start doing that gap analysis, that's going to help you understand whether you can try to pull this off by yourself or whether you want to engage someone like Stack Armor for that accelerator. Because in the case of Bluescape, it was a no-brainer for us once we sat down with Stack Armor and said, you know what, we need to get there. We want to get there fast. Our potential customers want us there yesterday. It makes a lot of sense for us to team up and do this together. That was one of the biggest lessons learned. Lessons learned also from container scanning, is that it's only the exploitable, the mature findings that are going to be in play. Where if you scan containers, you're going to get a lot of findings. Not all of them are going to count. It's only the exploitable ones. So those are some things that you want to understand. And then the shared responsibility model for the for us. Stack Armor, AWS, the mission owner, understanding the customer responsibilities, right? The CRM, all those things to understand what, Air Force, we're doing this together. There are some things that you guys are responsible for as well.
Awesome. Martin, did you have any additional lessons learned that you wanted to add, maybe from the accelerator perspective or just in general?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the other two kind of key components there, making sure that your sponsor is prepared and can supply at least 2 bodies from the joint validation team with access. is to engage an advisor early, as well as have one with an accelerator, right? The things that we talked about today were very technological in nature, but there's also the operations and management side, which is to say, the security stack and the tools, for example, that we put in place and deploy as code is vetted. It is pre-configured, leveraging industry standard tools for all of the auditing, logging, ticketing, scanning, static dynamic code analysis, everything that has to take place within a security architecture for those security operations and continuous monitoring things. Having them all selected and pre-configured, that takes months for the average organization. I mean, 3 to 4 months on average to go best of breed, talk to 3 different vendors, just so you can get to the point where you can actually begin. The last critical element is selecting a 3PAO. Do that early as well, and then make sure they're a part of things from the very beginning. In other words, from the kickoff with the DISA team and DoD, having them there is a critical step. And these items that we're talking about here, not just the last year, but many of these are changes that were not around last year. So the requirement for 2 bodies, conducting the DoD RAR no matter what, ensuring that you've got that EMASS access and things like that. These are all mandates now. So I will stop there, and I think we're just about at time, but if there are any questions, if you guys would like to know more, if you'd like to talk to Stack Armor for advisory, Bluescape about their solution, or Shaman as a 3PAO, the information is on the screen, and we look forward to hearing from you. Beyond that, I thank you for your time and hand it back to Johan.
Awesome. Thank you all. That was some really, really valuable information. Just so everyone knows, there is a question and answer section here. We've been trying to answer your questions as they come in. Feel free to drop your questions in there. If we don't get to them now, we'll follow up. We have your email, and we'll follow up with any answers that we think we can provide for you guys. We really want to take the time to thank everyone for taking the time today to join. We hope you got a lot of valuable information out of this. And like I said, please keep those questions coming.
So just for everyone's knowledge, we will be posting a link to the recording on our website. For the folks that we didn't get to answer, I know we have an anonymous question about IL-4/5 moving to 6 or a TS region. That's somewhat of a little more complicated question. There are a lot of requirements behind it, but we'd be happy to explain that in more detail for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And please do check out the answered section. There are a couple of other questions that sort of touch on that topic as well. So I think you can get a lot of information, but yes, please do follow up if you have any more questions.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.